the slideshow, let me take a moment and thank NRDC for their long-standing work and interest in this arena, and of course helping this meeting, in particular Colin and Mark, and thank you, Chris, for ringmastering this whole enterprise. And Assemblymember Carroll, if you're still on, thank you so much for your leadership. We're delighted to see bills like this moving forward. I'm going to try to be brief, but I wanted to help set the stage a bit on why this is important and what we need to do. Most of you are familiar with the idea of hard-to-abate and sectors, or hard-to-abate energy systems and so forth. Cement and concrete is the poster child for this. For starters, there's very large volumes of it. Worldwide, there's 5 billion tons of cement made every year. There's 55 billion tons of concrete that are used. That's just a lot of stuff. Second, even if you zeroed out all of the energy use associated with cement and concrete, wouldn't matter. The byproduct process emissions are half the total load, and we don't actually have ideas for that. Our idea deck is very limited and very lean. Third, to make this stuff requires high temperatures. You're basically burning rocks to melt rocks. This works at about 1450 degrees Celsius. We don't have a lot of options for that. Burning stuff is kind of it. And finally, there's no substitutes for the product itself. There may be viable product substitutes for steel, and there's a lot of good people working on it. We do not have a viable product substitute for cement and concrete. You might be able to make an I-beam out of something else, but we don't know how to make a freeway out of something else, and that's just where we're at. Just a quick point on this, without trying to belabor, this heat thing is a real thing, and people have to treat it seriously. We just did a study at Columbia last year. We did a second one for the Japanese government, which is the reference here that you see. The punchline is just the heat from heavy industry emits more than all the cars and planes in the world. And I dare say people think about cars and planes a bit more than they think about process heat for heavy industry. So, and the hottest temperature, the largest part of that, is from cement and concrete. We just need to start taking shots on net if we want to make any progress here. This is what a typical cement plant looks like. Heat goes into the preheating and the pre-calcining, and it goes into the rotary kiln. Usually that is solid fuel, because solid fuel's free. That's why it's used. In addition to that, there are some physical properties in the kiln itself for why they use solid fuels that are hard to replace. The process emissions come out almost entirely from the rotary kiln, and again, that's just hard to manage no matter how you do it. State of New York makes a lot of this stuff, 1.4 million tons of cement every year. The state itself uses twice that amount of cement. There's cement that's brought in from other states. And almost all of this is made in a very small set of locations where you have a limestone or a marble rock body next to a river. There's the 3 green plants, or the 3 green sites, including the one that Assemblymember Carroll mentioned, the Lafarge-Holcim plant outside of Albany. The good news is that there's now stuff to do. 2 years ago there wasn't. Now there kind of is. And this is the full list of things that are out there to do. I'm only going to talk about a few of them, but there is a wider set, and the bill actually tries to be comprehensive in how it thinks about this, which is very welcome. One of the ones I'm most interested in is CO2 absorbing cement and concrete, where you have embodied CO2 going into the cement. The most common of these are CO2 curing examples. I'll talk about that in a moment. And I know that we have a representative here from Carbon Cure, who's one of these important companies. You can do it also by mineralizing not just the cement, but the aggregate. This is a big play. 80% of the mass that goes into concrete is aggregate. If you can start putting CO2 into the aggregate, you have a big play. It's not easy, but it's something we need to start thinking about. Second pathway is just substituting for the cementatious material itself. That's usually clinker, which is the calcium oxide that goes into Portland cement. There are cementatious additives like fly ash. People are using a certain amount of that already. There's other things you can use like calcium sulfate. But the bottom line is there's stuff that you can use to substitute and dematerialize. In the U.S., that's mostly a standards issue. In many parts of the world, they use 54% substitute for clinker. Like, you can get very high fractions of that and still have a good concrete. That's basically a standards issue, means it's a statutory or regulatory issue. That's something that's good to think about. Alternative to that is just switching the fuel. Like I said, we're generally using solid fuels. These solid fuels are in the United States and around the world are almost entirely coal or petroleum coke. In some places, they're even worse than that. So there's other things you can use. Just switching coal to gas actually is a very large alternative. That's not going to be great for the state of New York for the reasons you guys are all familiar with. But switching coal to hydrogen, especially in the preheater or the calciner, is a good option. That hydrogen can be blue or that hydrogen can be green, but it has to be decarbonized hydrogen. Already, a lot of cement plants use waste. Some of that's done in New York. There's a material called raggertail that was allowed to be used in cement kilns recently. That's basically a mixture of paper wastes and plastic. But there's other ways to think about it. Upstate forestry wastes are a big thing and could be used better than they are today. And last but not least, efficiency and carbon capture and storage. Efficiency is something the industry has done a lot of already. There are still a couple of places to go, but largely they've improved their efficiency by 60% over the past 30 years. It's hard to get them to be more efficient. For carbon capture and storage, that's really important, especially for hydrogen production, but the state of New York doesn't have a lot of options for that. There aren't places to store CO2. So that's something on an international or sort of a systems-wide approach is going to yield real benefits. We're looking for that in the state of California especially, but for the state of New York, it probably won't deliver the goods, so I'll only talk about it passingly here. As I said I would be brief, I'm going to move through the rest of this quite quickly. There are, in fact, a bunch of companies that put CO2 into cement and concrete. The most notable of these, one of them is local, one of them is kind of local. The local one's Solidia. They're based out of Piscataway, New Jersey. They so far have the highest loadings. They have up to 15 to 30% loading of CO2 into the cement. They also have an efficient process that runs at a lower temperature, so they have 40% reduction in the production. So straight up, you can get something on the order of 70% abated CO2. That's pretty good. These things are high-quality products. They're stronger, they're whiter, they're heavier, they are more durable, they're corrosion-resistant. All of these are good things, and they come in basically at market parity or below. The same thing's basically true for CarbonCure, which is a competitor for Solidity. It's a Canadian-based company. They have lower loadings, but they have a major advantage, which is that they have a ready-mix solution. Solidia does not yet have ready-mix. It's precast. That's 30 or 40% of the market. There's big precast companies in New York, but 70% of the market is ready-mix, and Solidia and CarbonCure, can do that. And they have 100 distribution sites around the United States, and there's large active production for both of these companies. There are also companies that put CO2 into the aggregate, that put CO2 into the rock mass that goes in. Those companies are generally less mature than Solidia or CarbonCure. Those companies are kind of ready to go. But thinking about the future and how you might ratchet up the standards through legislative action, this is something to keep track of and sort of keep your eye on that ball. With respect to making clinker itself, we've did a quick cost estimate of this, and this was just like, hey, if you took the thermal energy out and you put other kinds of energy in, what would it look like? I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. First of all, electrical heating is listed up here. I want to be clear about this. Electrical heating doesn't exist. We do not have a way to actually put electricity into these systems. So don't think you can do that. You can't. This was a hypothetical, okay? Literally, you would have to tear down the existing infrastructure and build something that doesn't exist yet. So just keep that in mind. Biomass comes in reasonably good. Hydrogen's substantially cheaper. It's also worth knowing that where you can do it, CCS on the full facility is basically the cheapest thing you can do. For all of these things, and this is really important, for all of these options, you're basically doubling the wholesale cost of production. It isn't free. You're doubling the wholesale cost of production. So you have to be careful about how you approach this from a legislative standpoint. The last thing you guys want to do is move the kilns to New Jersey and let them emit and bring in the same stuff, right? And you don't want to, even worse, you don't want to offshore it to some other godforsaken country like Canada. So the way that this gets managed is important. That's part of the reason I'm so enthusiastic about procurement. Procurement is a great mechanism to support local industry and do the right thing. I do want to leave this last bit here. I wasn't planning to say it this way when I made this slide, but I'll say it this way now. CCS ends up being an important option for this, especially for the process emissions. We really don't have another way to go about it. I'm sure you guys saw your new executive director and CEO, Gina McCarthy's comments on the Hill a couple of days ago. I thought her comments were pretty fair. I thought they were quite reasonable, even though that wasn't how they were represented in the press. And I've known Gina for a long time, and she's really got her eye on this ball. But thinking about how to speak proactively about CCUS, ideally outside the context of enhanced oil recovery, is something to be considered, and this is one of those things to consider. Again, not relevant to New York, but relevant to NRDC. This just sort of underscores this point. If you look at all of the options, and this is from the roadmap we did for the Japanese government, without CCS, the best you can get is 50%. It's just all you can get. If you can do a mixture of other kinds of things, there's more of what's available. And again, this is just in the production. Things like dematerialization and clinker substitution and other stuff will have a net positive effect. I'm going to really end the presentation here to talk about what's in the bill and where there's opportunities. Chris is going to give us a much deeper primer on the bill, so I don't want to belabor it. But out of the options that can be done, there's a handful of policy levers to be pulled that are worth talking through. For my money, number one is procurement. It would greatly accelerate the deployment for this stuff. As I said before, a lot of these companies exist. The thing they lack is customers. There is also a bunch of money parked on the sideline. I spend as much time in Midtown as you guys do, I'm sure, possibly more. I have regularly people calling me on the phone and say, hey, I want to create a special purpose investment vehicle and I want to put $500 million in it. Are there companies to invest in? And what they're basically asking is, do these companies have customers? Governments buy 50% of the concrete in the world. City governments, state governments, local, national governments buy half the concrete in the world. It is a huge lever in this sector. And again, you guys know about the specifics of Assemblymember Carroll's bill. I'm not going to talk about it here, but the most important thing is that there are multiple compliance pathways and it sends the right signal to let the market innovate and do what it needs to do. Second thing, this is a major policy issue, and I hope that NRDC and others pick this up, is the standards issue. One of the important things we found is that there's a state engineer somewhere, and the state engineer is required to buy Portland concrete by law. You have to amend the standard if you want them to buy the stuff. And the state engineer is thinking constantly, am I going to sign off on a bridge that collapses because I bought a substandard product? Like, you cannot roll these people with environmental consciousness. You have to give them something they can act on. It's important to know that most states, I don't know if that's true for New York, but most states have a performance-based standard. There's something to go with already that can be modified or that can be revised. In some cases, you can make something additional to do things, whether it's material substitution or these new formulations of stuff that aren't Portland cement. Creating these standards helps. Same thing with building codes. You guys have spent a lot of time thinking about how to reduce energy use in buildings through building codes. In terms of new buildings, in terms of modifications to buildings, etc., this is another one. There are architectural codes and laws in the state of New York that require a certain kind of concrete. There are ways to think about this that are just and sensible, which can bring these things into the market more rapidly. Additional options, number one thing to think about here is innovation. This reason why Solidia is in Piscataway, New Jersey, is because that's where the inventor of the technology is. He lives in Rutgers. There are people in the state of New York who are coming up with innovative ideas on this. And some of those are at NYU, and some of those are at Columbia, and some of those are in SUNY, and some of those are in CUNY, and there's people out there who would love to see their technologies come to market. Governor Cuomo proposed a Carbon Works foundry in his State of the State this last year, specifically in his Green New Deal on page, I think, 336 to 334, somewhere in there. He talks about this as something he'd like to set up. That's proving difficult, but NYSERDA is the point agency on this, and we're in conversations with NYSERDA now, as well as Pat Sappin's lead group at NYU. It would be helpful to have an accelerator incubator to get this stuff to market. If we have to wait 15 years until this stuff's mature, we're all going to regret that. Innovation is important. It's not a dodge, but you have to stimulate it through investment and through statute and through policies in a way that serves the goals of the state and serves the goals of the industry. Ultimately, the most useful thing is to get this stuff into the market. So whatever supports market entry and early cost reductions is well worth considering. Oftentimes, I hit a hurdle with people who are like, shouldn't we use precautionary principle? I understand that that's a valid ground, that that's a reasonable thing to think about. It is also reasonable to think about, instead of saying what should we do, it's helpful to think about what can we do, and this is a thing we can do.